If you are building websites using WordPress and the Divi theme and you'd like to learn how to create a pop-up in Divi without any plugins and just a few lines of custom code, then you are in the right place. I will show you step by step how to turn any section in the Divi Builder into a pop-up. Hi, my name is Ania and my goal here is to help you build beautiful websites. In this video walkthrough, I would like to show you step by step how to use the Divi Builder to add that pop-up functionality to your sites. We're going to create a section which is going to be hidden by default and we'll be using the button module as a trigger. Once our website visitor clicks the button, it will open our hidden section inside a full page overlay. Now, this video is going to have two parts. First part is for those of you who want to implement it quickly. I will show you what code you need to copy and where you can paste it, and then how to connect the section with the button trigger inside the builder. And in the second, longer part, we are going to build that functionality from scratch, and I will explain everything in detail and also give you a few different options and address different issues you can encounter. So if you're interested in learning how we can work with Divi, custom CSS and jQuery, make sure to stay with me till the end. Okay, so let's get started. First, the quick copy and paste version. There are two bits of code you are going to need, the CSS code and the jQuery code. You can copy it from our blog post, and here on my sample site, I've already added that CSS code into the general custom CSS tab. And the jQuery code is in the integration body. Okay, so that code is already there, quick copy and paste, and now I have a sample section. And here, first we need to create a section that's going to serve as the overlay. So just real quick, I'm not going to make it pretty, but just to show you how that would work. Let's add a simple text module. Okay, and now that section has to have a CSS class of DL Popup content. DL Popup content. And also let's add a background maybe. Let's make it like semi-transparent. So that is one element, DL Popup content, the CSS class on a section, but it also has to have an ID. An ID can be anything you like, so let's just call it my popup, okay? And now there's another element we are going to need. We can put our own close icon or button that will close the pop-up once it's closed, once we don't want to see it anymore. And that element also needs a specific CSS class. But first, let me just maybe change the appearance here a little bit. Let's add a white background, some padding to our row, and maybe let's limit its width a little bit. So sizing, max width, let's say 600 pixels. Okay, so that is the content of my pop-up. I can add any number of rows here, any modules really, but one additional module I would like to use here is an icon. So let's find a close icon. Let's do this one. Let's change it a little bit, just make it a bit smaller, and in the advanced position, let's position that absolutely in the top right corner, and we can do a little offset, -40 and -40 from the side, something like that, or we can move it outside of the row Well, basically, we can position it anywhere we like using the builder settings. But one element that is needed here is the CSS class DL Popup Close. DL Popup Close, that is our closing X icon, a CSS class. And now we want to add a trigger, a button module that will, when once clicked, it will show our pop-up. So here, button, open pop-up, there it is. Let's move it here. Sorry, okay, so there it is, and it also needs a CSS class, DL pop-up trigger, and it also needs a URL. So in the content link, button link URL, we will use an ID of the section that we want to open when clicked. So I added ID of my pop-up, and now here my pop-up with a hash symbol, just like it would be, you know, an anchor link. So that name has to match the ID on our section. Okay, one last thing, if I want to make sure that that background stretches over the entire page content in the design settings of the section, I also want to set the min height to 100%. It's not going to make any difference here in the builder because the 100% height is the parent element needs to have a set height, and it's not happening in the builder, but it will be happening with the custom code we've added. So it right now, if we save that and exit the builder, our element is hidden. We don't see that section, right? And when I click the button, it shows, and then I can click my X icon to hide it. So super easy. And if you'd like to start even quicker, I have a sample page layout with 3 different pop-up designs. Let me just show you real quick. We have a contact form here in one. The second one has a video and a button, and also we are closing it with the icon. And that third one, it uses the button to close it, and also if I click on the background here, it will also close. So just to show you real quick, if I enable the builder here, I can edit each section right here in the builder, just like I would normally would. There is one code module here, which includes that CSS code and jQuery code right there on the page. You can copy and paste it where it belongs, or just leave it like here, because if you want to use that pop-up functionality just on one particular site, you can work with a code module like this, like on that layout. And yes, so you can go ahead and download this 3 JSON file from our website. Now, if you'd like to better understand the code behind this functionality, let's try to recreate this from scratch. Okay, so that is a third website, a separate site. It looks similar, but it is a separate site. I don't have any custom code here yet. And I just have the same setup. So that button has a CSS class of DL pop-up trigger and a link of ID contact. And now my section below has a CSS ID contact, a CSS class DL pop-up content. So these are the classes we need to make it work, the classes we are going to work with. Okay, now on the front end of that site, right now I see the whole thing, right? It's just right there in the builder, so it's not hidden. And if we think about what is a pop-up, it's basically an element, a section, or just an HTML element that is fixed on top of all the other content on your page. So we can make sure that this section is just fixed on top and hidden, And with jQuery, we're going to add and remove a certain CSS class to make it visible with that class or back to invisible without that class. But first, we are going to need additional container, not just fixing the section itself, but it will be, trust me, much easier if we have additional wrapper, a div element that holds that section, and we can add that with jQuery. So I am going to work from my style sheet here, and it's a jQuery code. It can go to the integration tab in your theme options, but here it's just going to be easier for me to add that code here directly in editing my child theme from the code editor. So I have a separate piece of code for a different tutorial for a slide-in header section, but that part is in the jQuery document ready function, and now we want to target each section that holds the content of our pop-up, so a section with a class DL pop-up content, right? So to target it, like this, each. So for each element with that class, we're going to perform a function, like this. And we want to wrap that element with additional container. And actually, I think it will be best to use two, not just one. And I will explain why a bit later, but just like that, we want to target this, the thing that we are selecting, that DL pop-up content. Using wrap method, we can basically specify the HTML structure we want to wrap that element, the outer wrapper. So it could be a div with a class DL pop-up wrapper. And as I mentioned, I want to have two containers. I will explain why in a moment. So a second div with a class DL pop-up inside. Okay, we don't need to close that. It will do that for us. And now, just semicolon here. Now, if I save that file and open that page, refresh, and inspect that, we'll be able to see that this section, you see div with ID contact, that's the ID I added to the section, and a class ETPB section. It's wrapped in two additional divs, DL pop-up wrapper and DL pop-up inside. Now I want this pop-up wrapper to work as a full page overlay. So to do that, let's select it, add a new CSS in our page inspector. For now, I will copy that CSS in a moment, but here we want this wrapper, that overlay, to have position fixed. So position fixed, and then to make sure that it fills entire viewport, we can set top, right, bottom, and left position to 0. So top 0, right 0, bottom 0, left 0. Okay, but we have to remember that we only want this to be fixed, covering everything else, when we are looking at the page from the front end, not in the builder. And we can use a CSS class, the body element, when in the builder has additional CSS class of ETFB, and here we won't find that class when we are looking at the page on the front end. So to change that selector, we can add that body element with a node selector, node, and then ETFB CSS class. So if our DL pop-up wrapper is inside a body that doesn't have ETFB, as I mentioned, that's the CSS class only added to the body container while previewing the page in the visual builder. So when it doesn't have that class, then it's positioned fixed, okay? Now we also want to fix the Z index so that it covers the rest of the page. So Z index, let's go with 99. And the reason I've added 2 and not just 1 is for the scrolling issue. If an element is fixed, it has position fixed, we won't be able to scroll the content inside if the content, the first child element is longer than that fixed container. So for that, we also want to target that DL popup inside. That parent won't be fixed. We just need to make sure that the height is set to 100% and overflow Y is set to scroll, so that if there is more content, it will allow for scrolling through that pop-up. Now I will copy the CSS, that's not needed. I will copy that CSS and place that in my style sheet in the child theme. Okay, let's save that. And now back here, we can see if this is fixed in the visual builder as well. So if I refresh the page, now the CSS gets applied. It looks like what I just wrote in the Chrome inspector. But now if I enable the builder, it goes back to where it was, basically. Just to show you real quick, if we inspect that page here, the content of our page is put inside an iframe. Let's find that. Yes, so here's an iframe with our page preview, and then the body tag has lots of different classes, but there is that ETFB CSS class here in the builder. As I showed you, it's not there on the front end. That's why the CSS for that wrapper doesn't work here, and the section is just below our content. It's not covering all our builder controls and other elements. So that's great. Now let's just adjust that a little bit. First, to make sure that our overlay is also full height, inside our section settings, design, sizing, min height set to 100%. Okay, it's not going to affect the builder preview because the parent container doesn't have a set height, but on the front end, our parent, the DL popup inside, it has a set height, the height 100%. That's the same height as the fixed, the second container. So this will work on the front end. Now let's save that, exit the builder here. If we refresh the page, okay, so it is on top of everything. Now we want to make sure that it is hidden, right? We don't want to see that pop-up right away when we load the page. So to do that, let's go back maybe here. So DL pop-up wrapper, it has to have opacity 0. And we've set, we will also set visibility to hidden, so that we cannot select that in our cursor or anything. And we will be adding a CSS class through jQuery for the pop-up when it's visible. And then when that element has that class, so again, we will target the same thing, DL pop-up wrapper, but with additional CSS class pop-up is visible. So once that element has that pop-up is visible class, the opacity will be set to 1 and visibility to visible. Now for the smooth transition, we also want to add a transition property to the element before it gets that class. So transition, and let's do 0.5 second. All elements, we want to transition everything, all CSS properties through the duration of half second with the is in out timing function, for example. Okay, so this is not going to do much more than just hide our pop-up on page load, right? So if we want that element to trigger a class, to add that class when we click the button, we need to use jQuery, right? So just let me go back to my scripts file. Now the CSS class I am using on a button is called DL Popup Trigger. So DL Popup Trigger. On click, we want to perform a function, but first I will use off method, and that's to remove any previously attached JavaScript, and Divi is using a JavaScript for links that use the anchor link with the hashtag to do the scrolling effect. So we want to remove that. We don't want the page to scroll when we click. We want nothing to happen except our own function that is going to happen on click. So next click, and here function. Let's also add a parameter here so that we can do the prevent default method. That's another thing. We don't want the page to go back to the top when the anchor link is clicked. So first that prevent default, like this, okay? And then we can basically do what we like. What will happen when we click our button? First, we have to find out what's the URL of the button, because that's our connection. The URL is the ID of our section. So let's create a variable section ID that's going to equal this, well, that trigger href attribute. So this attribute attr href, and that variable will already, if we were to echo it, it will say hash contact for our example, because remember back here our hidden section has ID contact, right? And that's the URL of our button trigger. The URL here is href contact. So, and then we want to use that section ID and add a CSS class to its closest parent, to the wrapper container, not the section itself, but the wrapper. So we will target that, and instead of doing, ID contact, we can use the variable, so section ID, and we are not adding a class to the section itself, to the parent container. So we can use the closest method. It will look at the DOM tree app until it finds an element with given attribute, in our case a CSS class of DL Popup wrapper. So now once we have that wrapper that's wrapping this section with the same ID as our link, we can add a class. So add class Popup is visible. Okay, so that's the simplified version. Let's save that and let's see if it works, okay? Let's refresh the page. Once I click, the element shows. Now nothing happens when I click the DL Popup close. We have to specify a separate element because our icon uses a class DL Popup close. So let's go back here and let's write a second function. If we click an element with a class DL Popup close. Click. Let's do function. Again with that the same prevent default methods. So E prevent default. Okay. And whenever element has a class, popup is visible. So any popup that's currently visible, we want to remove that class. So remove class popup is visible. Okay, it should be as simple as that. Let's save that. Go back here, refresh, open popup, and now DL popup close. Let's see. Did I save that? Here we need a class selector that was missing here, a dot at the beginning. So we are selecting the class and then removing the class. Okay, now it should work. Let's go back here, refresh. Lovely. So the basic functionality is there. Now there are a few things we would want to fix here. First, the overlay, the wrapper, you see it's a full height, no matter if we have our admin bar here. So we want to adjust that position for the admin bar. You see, if that pop-up wrapper top position would be 32 pixels, that's right underneath that's the height of the admin bar. With top 0, the content goes below the admin bar, underneath it, right? So if our body, again, our body element has a class admin bar, if admin bar is visible, so we can target that with CSS. And there are a few heights we should address if you want this to make sure that it works good on mobile too. The admin bar height on desktop is 32 pixels, but it changes as we resize our browser when it goes to 781, 782, and 3. So 782 and below, the admin bar is 46 pixel. And then below 600, I think, it's no longer fixed. So if we were to scroll, I mean, it is actually, yes, it's no longer fixed. So here it could be top 0 because our admin bar will scroll up as we scroll the page. So starting from 601, we want the top position to be 46 pixels up until 782, and then we want to set position 32. So let's go back here. That's what you already have in the in the code you can copy. So I will just paste that here. So just so that you know what it does. Media query of min width 600 and max width 782. That's when the top position should be set to 46 pixels. And it's again body without a class, but with a class admin bar. Then our DL wrapper position changes, and from the screen with 783 and up, the top position goes to 32, but only if that admin bar CSS class is there. So that is the CSS bit that is adjusting the overlay position for the admin bar and also for mobiles. So let's save that. That should move the content underneath the pop-up here if we get in touch. Now it's here, now it goes a bit down, so that works well. Now what if we would like to center the content inside our element? We can do that section by section with custom CSS and flex mode, but we can also make sure that the content is always centered. So basically our DL pop-up content, so the section that holds our elements, let's do DL pop-up content, would need to use position, display flex, flex direction column, and justify content center. Now we only have one row in this example, but let me show you. Let's add that CSS to my style sheet. Where is it? Right here. So that's one thing, to center rows inside the column in the center, but let me just show you how would that look like if we had more than one row for our section. So enable the builder. I have one row here, but if I were to add a second row with a text module, for example, okay, so that's fine. Let's do a background here so we can see that better. Now if I save that, exit the builder, show the section. Oh, I have to refresh so that my CSS works. Did I save that? Let's see, DL pop-up content, display flex. No, I didn't save that. Okay, so let's save that, sorry. And now let's refresh again. Get in touch, it is in the center, but the more rows we have, there will be an issue with a margin here. And that is because, let me show you, each row has margin auto set. The Divi default CSS adds margin auto to every row, and that includes margin top and bottom. So we don't want our rows inside our section that should center things to have that margin. So we can use DL pop-up content as the parent container and target all ET/PB row inside, and make sure the margin top is set to 0 and margin bottom is also set to 0. Margin. Okay, and then it will be right there in the center. So that is also should go to our style sheet. And now any any number of rows we add inside our DL pop-up content inside our section, it will be always positioned in the center. So that goes here as well. Okay, let's move on. Let's save that this time. And now small things. So for example, as I hover over this icon, the cursor doesn't changes to an pointer, the little hand cursor. So to fix that, it's very simple. DL pop-up close, so that element that we're using to close our overlay, a class DL pop-up close, cursor pointer. And now as I hover, I have that nicer looking cursor. So just little things. Now there is another issue we want to address here and that's body scrolling. I don't have, let's enable the builder and let me add some more text here so that we have maybe like this, so that we can scroll the page, okay? And then you will see that when I open the pop-up, I can, oh, I didn't, let's refresh. When I open the pop-up, I can still scroll the page behind that, and to fix that we would need to add overflow hidden to our body element, but there is no way to target body when our pop-up is visible, so we can do that with with the same method, adding a CSS class to the body element, the same way as we are adding it to our wrapper. So here for inside our jQuery, when we open the pop-up, so when we're clicking the trigger, the section gets a class and also a body element gets a class of DL no scroll. And then we can target that class and set overflow hidden, and we want to remove that once the close trigger is clicked. Remove class DL no scroll, and then inside our CSS, body no scroll, DL no scroll overflow hidden. Save that. Let's try. Refresh the page. Now I try, but I cannot scroll behind, and when the pop-up is closed, I can scroll again. So that's one issue you may want to fix. Now, another thing you have to be mindful of when working with that exact method is z-index and the navigation problem. Now, let me go back to my, that's not this page. Let me go to my theme builder. So Divi theme builder, and for that page, I've hidden a header, but if I show that header, the default Divi header for that page. Let's refresh that here. Sorry, that's not that page. 1 second, let me just assign that to this one as well. Okay, this should work. Let's refresh. Now, if I open the pop-up, it is basically underneath my navigation, and I could set like 1,000,99999 z-index on my wrapper, but it's not going to change the fact that the wrapper, because the z-index property can only be as high as the parent container's z-index, and our ET builder inner content wrapper, that's wrapping a content of each header layout, page layout, and footer layout, has a z-index of 1. So my wrapper, which is placed inside my page, well, it will be always, it won't be higher than the header z-index, which is 5 nines, because that ET builder inner content z-index is only 1. Again, to fix that, we can add our class, the pop-up is visible, to that ET builder inner content div. But we want to make sure, because there's more than one element of that kind. If we would have a footer, it also has ET builder inner content inside. So we want to be specific and only target the element that's the parent of our pop-up, right? If our pop-up is placed on a page, we want to make sure that the page content z-index changes. If it's a footer, then the footer z-index. So that's going to work very similarly to what we already have written for that section ID closest DL pop-up wrapper, because now we need to find the closest ET builder inner content. And let me copy that from here because it's the same. So again, when we click the trigger, we find the section ID, and the closest ET builder inner content will get the pop-up is visible CSS class, and then in our child theme style sheet, we want to make sure, and I will just make it quicker, we want to make sure that when ET builder inner content has a class of popup is visible, the Z index will be higher than the Z index of our navigation. So this should work. Now let me check. Or first let's check if I saved both files. No, I haven't. So let's save that. And now let's refresh the page. You see the Z index changes. And that's also one thing you have to note of. If our Z index on the page content changes, the header, if it's fixed, it's no longer visible. You see, as I click, it goes back to default. So if you are using fixed navigation, it would be best to place that pop-up content inside your footer template. And the reason for that is when we change the, let me just maybe quickly show you this. From that page, I think I've set it in the library. So in my custom footer, I can add my pop-up content. I think it's this one. Use this section. So that's the same. Let me just make sure it has a sizing of, yes, min height is correct. Okay, so that's, if I place my section in my footer layout, let's save that. Let's go here and remove the section from the page. Because now I would have two, right? One is here and the second one is in the footer. I can remove that from here, save my page, exit the builder, and now it covers the navigation, but navigation is still there. If I'm using semi-transparent background, I can still see my navigation because only the footer Z index changes, not the page's Z index. Okay, so that is only if your pop-ups have semi-transparent background and you're using fixed navigation. You want to, it would be best to place your pop-ups in your footer instead of the page content. Okay, so that would be the top navigation Z index issue. Now let's try adding an animation here, because right now it just fades in, but we could add an animation to our rows inside that section. So the section background fades in just like it does now, but the row can do a different type of animation. And it's very, very easy. We can use, for example, transform property and just scale it a little bit, make it smaller initially, and then grow it as it gets into the viewport. So to do that, what we'll target is our ETPB row, which is inside of DL pop-up wrapper. But only when the wrapper gets a class of pop-up is visible. Okay, so with pop-up is visible, then ETPB row, any row inside that section, once it's visible, we can define add animation property to it. But before we can set our animation, we have to define our keyframes. So let's say that my animation will be called, I think I name it scale in. So add keyframes, scale in. And here we would define two states. One is 0%, so at the beginning, these are the properties it's going to have, and at 100%, these are the properties. So at 0%, we want opacity to be 0. At 100, opacity should be 1. And we, as I mentioned, let's use transform. So transform scale 0.3 transform, and then scale 1, so that it is its actual size when animation finishes. So transform scale 1. Okay, and now we can use that scale in animation. We can use the shorthand for instead of defining animation name, animation duration, animation timing function, we can use a shorthand. So for animation CSS property, first is animation name, scale in, then duration 0.5 seconds. Timing function, it could be is in, linear, but we can also play with cubic Bezier. There is, it's 1 second. So on cubicbezier.com, you can create your own, like something like this. And now that would be so that it grows a little bit over the initial size. So instead of that default like is in, let's try with something like that, and you can play and see what cubic Bezier works for you. But here we can just basically paste that timing function. Next, we can define delay, and we want this to happen after the initial section fades in, and it fades in with also half second. So a delay could be that 0.5 seconds. And the final shorthand property we are adding here is a fill mode. So we want to use both, and what it does, it makes sure that that initial state as well as this one is visible both ways. So initially that row will have opacity 1, and when animation finishes it will stay with that opacity that's set at 100%. So that's that both right here. And now if we save that, let's open our page, refresh, it fades in, and then it grows in with that different timing function that grows a little bit more and then shrinks. So I think that looks very nice. Now there is another thing that we have to be mindful of, and I already found a way to take care of that, is playing videos inside our pop-ups. So if we go back here and let me add a section with a video, it can go to a page, that's fine. Add from library, and I have my pop-up video. And here I'm using just a video file, but if we were to add another video, just to show you, and let's use that YouTube right here, okay? Now let me show you how would that work. Watch the video, and I have two, and then once I click play and close the pop-up, it still plays in the background. Okay, so we have to take care of that. And if we look inside our source, the videos, the YouTube and Vimeo videos will be loaded through an iframe. So there, I'm not saying no, but there are ways we could play or pause the video that's loaded in an iframe, but it would require a separate script connecting to YouTube or Vimeo API. But a simplest way I could think of is replacing the source attribute. So source is the link of our video. If we store that as a variable and then re-add that on a close of the pop-up, the video will stop because it will lose its source for just a quick second. So that's the workaround I could find with the inline video, with that element that is placed here as a video tag, we have much more control. So if we're not loading a video from an iframe, we can pause or even play that video when we click the button. We will have to find that source, store it as a variable, and then reattach it when we click the pop-up close button. Okay, so going back to our scripts file, it's going to happen here inside our close trigger click function. We want a variable, and that is, let's call that pop-up video iframe. So we want to first find, because let's look at the HTML structure. Our close icon, this element, this is what we are clicking, the DL pop-up close. It is somewhere next to that video. So first we have to find a parent. We have to go back to the parent, the wrapper, and then we will look within that wrapper for a CSS class of this one, the one with the iframe. It's in ETPB video box CSS class. Well, they both are in that div with a class ETPB video box. If it's a video, inline video, or when it's an iframe like this, it's also in ETPB video box. So going from our close trigger, which is here, we have to first find the wrapper, find the parent, and then look inside that wrapper for a video. Okay, so back here, let's find this. So pop-up close, closest wrapper. Closest, go up to the DOM until it finds, so similar to parents, but it will only return one element, the closest one. So DL pop-up wrapper, and then find within that element ETPB video box. And for an iframe, we don't want that div, but we want the iframe itself. So here we want to change the source, find the source, and change that source attribute of an iframe. So not only ETPB video box is our target, but iframe inside. ETPB iframe. Okay, so that will be iframe with our video link. Now the source, that URL, we also need to store that so we can reattach that. So another variable, pop-up video source, like this, and that would be that iframe source attribute, basically. So this would be attribute source, like this. And now so we have these two variables, and we want to reattach that source attribute to that iframe again. So pop-up video iframe, we are changing the attribute, the source, with our variable, with the same one, like this. Okay, so that just checks what is, like, it checks what is our attribute source, and when we set two parameters here inside, we can set our own, basically. So Now, if I save that, or maybe let's do the second one for the video HTML version. So var popup video HTML, and that is going to be very similar. So let's copy that, but instead of looking for an iframe, we are looking for a video tag. And then we don't need to set the source, because if we look here, the video is just, yes, it has a source, but with a video, we can control video video elements with jQuery, with simple, to trigger a pause, for example. We can use trigger and then play, pause, or stop. So back here, on that, we will trigger. You can use pause. I think I used pause in my example. Okay, so this should work now. If I check that, refresh my page, watch the video. Now I'm playing the video, but as soon as I close the pop-up, the video stops from playing. For the inline video, I'm playing. Hey there, it's just a sample. And when I click the pop-up, it paused the video, so you could go back to that same exact video, click the same exact spot, right? So that's it gives us much more control. Okay, so that was handling videos inside the pop-up. Now let me show you one last thing, is to how to close the pop-up when clicking on the, actually it won't be the last thing, but let's go and let me show you how to close the pop-up when we click the background, okay? And it's very simple, but kind of, you know, a different approach. So again, back here, let me just quickly remove that from here. I have a third section. Let's add that below with just a plain content. But what's different here is I used a button, and that button has a class DL Popup Close. So the same as icon module, okay? But if we look at our structure, I also have a row here, and that row also has that class, DL Popup Close. But the important fact, it has that background, so that is the background we see. The section background is set to transparent, row has the background, and it has position absolute, okay? And then width and height in the sizing, with max width and height are all set to 100% so that it stretches behind the content. Let me just go back to here. Okay, so this is, I'm in that gray row settings. You see, now it is green. We can make that semi-transparent. Remember that the section has to have background set to transparent. And in the advanced, if that wouldn't be positioned absolutely, it would be just a, you know, a row, and then the second one is below. But since our section is relative, as soon as we do position absolute and make sure the sizing is set to 100%, then it will stretch. And because it has that DL Popup Close CSS class, it will act as our trigger, the same as the button or the X icon, okay? So just exit the builder, open pop-up, and now I can click here and it will get hidden, okay? Okay, one last, I said last already twice, it's not going to be last. Okay, now let me show you how to trigger the pop-up from our menu, okay? Because it is going to require a slight edit, because if we look at our jQuery code, what the pop-up trigger, we are using its own href attribute, okay? We would have to also, because inside our menu, let's do appearance, menus, So this is my primary menu, and let's add a sample link. So custom links, URL set to, let's show the contact pop-up. So ID contact, show pop-up, add to menu. Okay, the URL needs to be set to ID of the section we want to show, and the label can be anything, but we need a custom CSS class. So make sure the CSS classes are visible in your screen options. And now let's add DL pop-up menu CSS class to our menu item. Let's save that. And now let me show you the HTML structure here, because right now my show pop-up is a list item that has that DL pop-up menu, and my link with that href is inside. The class is not added to the link itself. That is why right here we have to use the DL pop-up trigger that will work on buttons or any links with that class. But we can define a second target, DL pop-up menu direct descendant, so right caret A. Okay, so first A inside DL pop-up menu will also do the same thing. Like we will look at its href attribute, not the parent container, right? It will only work this way. So now if I save that, refresh, show pop-up, and my contact section ID with section ID contact will get visible. I can still trigger it from multiple places at once. Okay, and now, yes, this time it is one last thing I want to show you is to how to trigger the pop-up, because I know you will be asking me how to show that pop-up initially on page load after a few seconds delay, for example. So for that, we need to use a set timeout function. So inside our jQuery code, right here, this needs a semicolon, and here, set timeout function like this, and then comma, and here we have to specify the duration of that timeout in milliseconds, so 3000 would be 3 seconds. And inside we can do the same thing we are doing for our pop-up trigger, right? We want to do this, okay? But our section ID, it's not going to be, you know, this attribute href. We have to define it ourselves. So section ID would be basically the ID we want to show. So let's show the one with the content, the green. Okay, so ID content closest wrapper will have a class popup is visible, and the builder inner content will have the class popup is visible, and body will get a class DL no scroll after 3 seconds initially on page load. Okay, no, this doesn't. Okay, so let's save that. Let's try that. Refresh my page. 1, 2, 3. Where are you? I know what I did wrong. Okay, let's see. The section ID content, do I have that ID? One is video. It's actually contact 3. Okay, so yes, I don't have that ID. Contact 3. Contact. Sorry. Okay, now it should work. Now let's refresh the page. There it is. Okay, got it. Okay, so that would be all. I think we covered everything. The CSS and jQuery code should be clear, or at least clearer now. As you can see, there is loads of possibilities here, and you should be able to create any type of pop-up overlays on your Divi websites using this method. Let me know in the comments if you found this helpful. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.